friends, welcome to Running with Rainbows August class. Today we're going to learn a little bit about spontaneous landscapes. So to do today's class, you're going to need some watercolor paper, we're going to need some watercolor paint, some low-tack tape, and some brushes. Here are some quick examples of a style I created using spontaneous landscapes as the base. There's some silhouette work here that we're not going to cover in this class, but that's definitely something to look forward to. However, it gives you an idea of the range of spontaneous landscapes. I also recommend you try liquid watercolor if you haven't already. You don't have to, don't whip out and buy it. If you have your pan watercolors, your dry ones like I do as well, this is perfect too. Just be advised that this class may damage the top layer of those watercolor pans because you're going to dig into them a little bit and kind of use some of that chunk of pigment on your watercolor paper to create texture, to create depth in the piece for the landscape portion of it, and it will add a lot of high pigment value. So when we do our wet on wet technique, we'll be able to get a lot of color flowing. So here are some of the brushes I recommend you have. You're definitely going to want a wide flat brush. Now depending on how big you go, that will determine the size of the large brush you need. I'm going to do smaller, sort of 2 by 3 inch size. These here are about 5 by 7 as well is going to be an option. So a nice 1 inch flat brush would be perfect. But use whatever you have on hand. As always here with Running with Rainbows, I want you to experiment with what you've got. Get your stash of supplies that you may have not even tried yet open and start using them before you go out and buy new things. In any case, here's an example of a smaller tile, like a thumbnail look. I'm going to show you how to tape that down today. Again though, very simple technique, allowing for a lot of movement and spontaneity, hence spontaneous landscapes. So you have to be willing to embrace the unexpected. Now, once you get your watercolor layer down, you can always go back in with acrylic paint, which is what I'm showing you here. So these sharp green and yellow lines were created by going in when the watercolor was dry and putting a little bit of green and yellow on the edge of a palette knife and just scraping down. So you can do this effect as well with a piece of paper folded in half or a gift card type of material. So here I'm just showing you again what we're going to need for this class. I grabbed my liquid watercolor. It's from Walmart. It wasn't expensive. It does the job. Just to give you an example, we see a lot of these videos on social media of spontaneous landscapes, and we love that high pigment flow. So you want something that's very pigment, and blue is often one of the best colors in a palette anyway. Now I'm showing you the front of the watercolor paper just so you note that I ended up with a cold pressed pad. I prefer hot press because hot press has a smooth side to both sides. Cold pressed has a textured, toothier side and a smooth side. So when you're working with this desire for a spontaneous high flow pigment landscape, you want to pick the smooth side. So that's going to be the side that you don't see any kind of dimpling on, like you might maybe think of an orange peel. That would be the texture you don't want to work on, so you're going to flip it over. So here I'm just using some green low-tack painter's tape. If you find that it always tears, one of the tips and tricks that I can give you is that if you take the tape piece and sort of tape it down to your jeans or the sleeve of your sweater, press it and pull it, it will remove even more of the tack so that it doesn't rip the paper. However, if you take your time when you're peeling it off and you don't leave it on overnight as well, and you pull on a diagonal, you're less likely to grab the page. However, practice is perfect, so even after doing this for many years, sometimes I get nervous and the paper tears anyway, and that's just the reality of doing art, friends. So here I went around the border first, and now I'm splitting it in half, and this will be my sort of thumbnail style piece. These are wonderful to pre-make for yourself so that if you are in a mood to be creative, but you don't necessarily have 40 minutes, you've already got a bunch of pre-taped pieces. Yes, that means the tape is on the paper longer and you do run the risk of tearing. However, you should have some prepared surfaces for you to play on as a part of your art practice. Sustainable practices and sustainable studios is a big topic for me. So preparing yourself or front loading or stocking your fridge with things that get you excited to practice on, which taped lines definitely do, and spontaneous landscapes work for that as well for me. So when I have time and I'm not necessarily in the mood to paint, but I want to, contribute to my overall dream of a sustainable studio, I'll set up a bunch of these sheets so that I can come back to it when I'm in a mood to or need that opportunity to manifest a bit quicker. So here is some gold watercolor that I've molded myself doing the Color Wonder class, which is available in January here on Substack for the Color Wonder membership, or sorry, Substack members. So if you want to know how to make that, please feel free to revisit. You're able to access these videos unlimited. If you're only paying for this month to try this class, I would check January as quick as you can, because you do have a window of opportunity to access those classes on that trial run. So Manitoba landscapes are very limited palette. You'll see I've got here some ochre yellow, some emerald green, some burnt umber, some cobalt or ultramarine blue, and titanium white pre-mixed as a watercolor paint and then dried together. And then I also have titanium white watercolor paint solo. And here is blue I'm going to be using. I'm going to try it out. I'm going to use the liquid watercolor that I got in a tube at Walmart. Now in the demonstration pieces, you'll notice that that horizon line has texture. There is, because like I said, we're going to damage the top of those pans of watercolor just a little bit by chunking out of them, because we want that sort of grit, sandy texture. It's just the element I added. You of course can skip it. You don't necessarily need to do that to get this high flow, spontaneous landscape. So here we go. I'm going to start with my blue, because this one gives us the most instant gratification and awe that if you're searching for that satisfaction, here's the way to get it. So I'm going to apply this on a tiny little brush. I'm going to make a small line. I'm going to make it in the bottom 1/8 area of my taped off rectangle, and I'm doing it wet pigment on dry paper. I'm going to show you a few different ways. I'm going to do wet on wet. I'm going to show you wet in the top, dry on the bottom, all wet, so that you have a pre-idea before you play yourself. But as always, be open to play and be open to experimentation. If you want to make notes on each square's particular order of operations, feel free to do so. Get your art journal out. I did wet on wet here. I did wet on dry. I did dry on wet. Like, make those correlations for yourself. They will anchor more deeply. So here, what I did was I took a very wet, flat brush and ran it along, you can even go right on the line, but just with that one edge, that blue high pigmented watercolor. So as you can see, watercolor paint loves water, so it instantly jumps into that wet surface above the line and does not budge into the bottom where there is, of course, no water. So that is the joy of sort of playing around with your ratio when it comes to where you're going to leave your line of paint. So you can, of course, split your rectangles right in half, but I highly recommend working within the sort of thirds rule, where slightly off center or slightly more or slightly less is more interesting for the eye. So with these ones, I would keep the landscape area to the bottom half. I apologize for the length that this is sitting on this particular scene. I just ended up working along the bottom and forgetting to move the camera, and didn't want to just cut this piece off, because it does show again when I remember to pull the piece up what I've been doing. So in any case, as always, feel free to watch the entire video just to give yourself an idea of what the overall process is. That way, as you approach it, you're not as frustrated by any of the unexpected areas. However, this is a spontaneous landscape, so definitely expect the unexpected. Enjoy practice runs. This should be a wonderful way to sort of do a daily art experience where you don't have to put too much thinking into it. You can just use the 3 or 4 colors and have experiments where you apply wet and dry or different ratios to the rectangle. You use the bottom half, use the top half more. That kind of thing can be a lot of fun. All right, so here we are. We're going to work on the next rectangle. Now you can always draw lines right through both at the same time and work a bit quicker. But this is also a fun way to enjoy working in a miniature style with different colors, so that it's a little more impressionistic. You're not necessarily looking for individualistic details. You're not looking for hyper-realism or stressing yourself out to create those realisms. What you are doing is seeing landscapes. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how to sensitize your eyes and your mind to the landscapes. I laughed about how the Manitoba landscape was sort of a backdrop to my boredom as a child. Whenever we went to the lake and stuff, I mean, the prairies, it's a very long stretch of very similar shapes and colors, whereas in a lot of other places in Canada, mountains and hills and ranges add more variety. So I've since traveled a lot more in my adult life and can experience the landscape and scenery in a much more attitude of gratitude style, thank goodness. But when I was a kid, it was harder for me to appreciate it. So I was often uninspired by what I was seeing during the summer vacation. So I would end up in my head imagining, you know, fairylands and wonders and reading books and enjoying that whole sort of child life, right? So as an adult, though, you sort of get into the grind and you forget to look up and you forget to look around yourself. So having moved outside of the city, I experience the landscape in a more grateful state. As an adult, I'm just more grateful and aware of, how wonderful it is to live in Canada and the benefits of the things that we can have and experience here in Manitoba alone. The other day I was at a coffee lineup in a drive-thru, Tim Hortons here in Manitoba, and there was two young women at the light ahead of me on their horses heading back down towards the barn area, and that's not a common thing, but it's also not uncommon, so it was something just, to be grateful for. So enjoying those skies that I am experiencing now has been a wonderful sort of reawakening, and I'm grateful for that new perspective on something I've seen that's very familiar. So here I have showed you there how I kind of grabbed a little pinch of that pigment on the edge of my palette knife, and I'm just sort of dropping it onto a dry surface. We haven't changed anything just yet insofar as wet on wet kind of thing. Right now we're still using wet pigment on a dry piece of paper and then adding a very wet, clean brush. So if your water happens to get really muddy while you're doing this, take a minute to go ahead and empty it and put in a clean one, or have an extra vessel to your side with clear water for you to use as a clean on your brush, or to just dip for that final step where we have things merge. I'm also taking a bit of my gold and adding it in here. It may blend, and that's fine. It doesn't have to stay quite as rigid as those initial examples are. You can always come back on top of watercolor with pastels, which would involve using like a fixative as well to keep things from moving. You could come on top of watercolor before you use pastels with Posca acrylic paint pens. Acrylic paint can go on top of watercolor. So even if you're not super thrilled or jazzed with how your spontaneous landscape turned out or the results of practice, keep it. Don't waste the paper. You can paint right on top of it. There's plenty of classes on collage and how to use that as ephemera or dress material for paper dolls. Like, we have stuff here, right, friends? We can use it. We can make use of all of our extra art that maybe is just loitering around in our art space. So here I've gone and created a very wet upper area. I'm using my brush with clean water on it, and I'm just sort of dragging that paint I put on rather heavily with the water and letting it spread, allowing it to do what it wants. You can definitely manipulate the surface by lifting it up, as I've done, and letting it dribble higher, letting it dribble to the side, let it dribble down. I recommend you have a sheet of paper towel handy that you can fold and hold along the edge so that when you're letting it drip, it doesn't just drip into the square below it. That's a wonderful abstract piece that you could try out, but if you're not headed in that direction, I highly recommend you just be careful with the dripping and have a piece of paper towel there to catch it. And feel free to take your paintbrush and drizzle and help the landscape along. It's spontaneous, it's fun. You are learning while you're watching. We're watching the yellow and the blue here mix and mold. I can see that the top square didn't get a speck of water on it, so it looks very artificial there, but that might be great for, say, a winter themed piece where you might be featuring snow or glacier themes. So things to think about as you're working along. Try to avoid bringing to the table today your laundry list, your grocery list, your, endless list of grievances on the inside, and just give yourself the opportunity to experiment with color, to enjoy color, to reflect on the things around you. I'm using Manitoba as my example, but perhaps you live somewhere else where you have a more unique palette, different color patterns, different landscape shapes you want to represent. Absolutely. Create this unique perspective on your own landscape, what is around you. If you happen to live in a city and this looks more less organic and more structured, that's perfect too. If you're, cities are beautiful places with a lot of pops of color, and nowadays I find that there's more and more emphasis to create buildings that are more unique and interesting and less of the concrete jungle that we've sort of had over the last 30-40 years. So there's lots of land out there to be inspired by, and if you happen to be stuck in a house or sick or not able to get out and experience your local landscape immediately, thank goodness for the internet, and you can definitely go online and immerse yourself in a plethora of landscapes. It'd probably be great if you were working on a vision board or manifesting, say, a trip to somewhere amazing in your life, to work on a bunch of landscapes inspired by it, to sort of synthesize your subconscious and your hopes towards getting yourself to that place. These are options. These are ways art can definitely be used that have absolutely nothing to do with sales or art history or contributing to the canon of art at all. It's just a personal process, and I am grateful that art can wear so many hats in a way that appeals to so many different people, because I feel like that is one of the unique threads that ties the entire audience as well, right? You can be a viewer, you can be an artist, and you can still participate in that inner conversation and experience at your own level and feel rewarded in that participation. So here I've gone in, it's all dry. I've gone in with my pigment. Now I'm using a flat, clean water brush, and I'm just dragging it across the top. I'm not making a lot of brush strokes. I'm just dragging that water and allowing it to disturb the pigment that I've already laid down. How you approach it is entirely up to you. You can work from center out. You can work from top down. It really depends. I highly recommend you experiment and explore and find out. So here I've added some green and some yellow down. And I've decided to just keep a nice smooth stroke instead of creating texture just now. But you could go in with clean water, salt, saran wrap. There's lots of ways to achieve different textures by letting things dry on top of your watercolor paint. We're not exploring them today, but they are very easy to find on the internet. So if you're in the zone and you just want to play around today, absolutely throw some salt on top of this wet on wet, and when it dries it will create that kind of snowflake crystalline structure in it. But you can also just spend some time googling all of the different effects. Now if you happen to find that you have a lot of paint on your paintbrush and you don't necessarily want to dip it in the water and dilute it, you could spatter it on the other pieces that we have below or on the side. So don't feel you always have to dip your brush and clean it right off. If you've got a few other pieces going, trust me, spatter always adds a little bit of that oxygen to it that fades into a wet on wet really easily as well, so you almost wouldn't even notice that you spattered it in the first place. So here I'm going to try some different colors as well. I've been sticking to the prairie colors because that was the landscape that lives outside of my house and it's inspired my entire summer this year. But there's lots of different ways to explore a landscape. So I think I wanted to go on with like a light pink, sort of a sunset evening kind of tone. So I used some yellow as well, some yellow ochre's coming out. Now this is wet on wet pigment on a wet piece of paper. So it may take a minute to dry, and the nice thing is you can just start on your next section while that's happening, or you can take a minute just to put your brush down and breathe. I can't stress how much I find myself holding my breath when I'm working, so I highly recommend to you as well as you go just to take a second and take a deep breath. So here I've preloaded my tiny little fine liner brush with some emerald green watercolor paint, and I'm just dabbing in the suggestion of I think for me it was sort of like shrubbery, like a landscape full of organized shrubbery. It doesn't have to be more eloquent than that, friends, especially when you're experimenting. But I love throwing it down and watching how the green spreads and how it moves through the yellow ochre and where it heads, right? Like that's part of the joy of the spontaneous landscape, I feel, is observing the interaction of the water and the paint. So here I've got a bit of a round tip brush, and I've got some blue liquid watercolor paint on it, and I'm just going directly onto that yellow ochre as it's already wet with the wet paint. So this one is primarily wet on wet. I will tell you right up that it definitely looks more diffused as far as all of them goes, and rightly so. Dry on wet would have one impact. Really wet brush on dry watercolor paint has sharper edges, but wet on wet is all about that translucent kind of hazy vibe. So these are ones that are nice to do where you come back over top with a sharper, like something in the foreground focus, and that serves as your background element. Again, just putting some water down on this one. My brush isn't clean, so there's a hint of ochre in there, and I'm fine with that because at the bottom here I'm going to explore having a burnt umber base. I really want to embrace brown. I feel like that's going to be a really big color going into fall and winter this year. I'm feeling a lot of pomegranates and burgundies, which I love. I love fall colors, and you know, that beautiful contrast of, say, a golden orange is so nice. So seeing it in my landscape and familiarizing myself and enjoying it is definitely achievable through my art as well. It brings it into my subconscious. It tells me I'm valuing that color because I'm using it. I often steer away from orange and brown, and I think that that leaves a lot of extra paint, but you can mix your orange with blues and get various neutral blue tones, right? And you could mix your brown into lots of different shades to help bring out that neutral tone in a primary, or sort of new blended down kind of thing. So now I've gone in with some green and some purple or violet, ultramarine violet watercolor. It is on a wet surface again, so we've got diffuse, but we're using really bold colors, so I'm interested to see how they'll blend and interact with each other. And I mean, you can't, like, the genius of just a dot and a dash, right? This is very simple brushwork. There's nothing magical about it. There's a little bit of faith involved and just allowing it to do its thing once you've put it down, but that can be a lot of fun. And if you find yourself being really tight in your own practice, these are fun ways to loosen up before you get into your main body of work for the day. So here I've gone in with a bit of titanium white and some purple that was on my brush in the top half of the sky, and in between them now I'm sort of adding in some it's Mayan red, I believe, from my Natural Earth Paint watercolors, and I'm just sort of creating a sort of, I can't think, vignette style where there's more of a triangle shape, so the focus is at the top center of that particular rectangle, which is something you can explore fun as well through your spontaneous landscapes, is focal points. That's not something I'm very educated on, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about it, but just where the viewer is looking. I think that landscapes, you can have a lot of fun with directing the movement and the swing of things through that focal point. So I hope to learn more about it and then eventually be able to offer some classes that explore it from a very more knowledgeable point. Here I've taken a bit of the yellow ochre watercolor on my palette knife, and I'm just putting it on the wet sky. It's already got wet paint on it, and I've added some gold into the base as well. So these are the fun ways you can continue to keep working when it's wet on wet, and eventually, you know, you do need to put a pin on it and come back to it when it's dry. But as you get that background of a landscape and that spontaneity, and you can now direct the the direction of it a bit more. You can apply your own desired effects because you've got a base going. You're not as intimidated by that white sheet anymore and the worry of perfection. So that is definitely the fun part. Here I'm going to show you going right over the tape, right through it, because of course you're going to peel the tape off at the end, so there's no reason to interrupt your stroke. And there is something to be said for how you hold your brush, where that energy in your stroke is coming from. Watercolor is a much more controlled medium and skill set. I'm trying to think of the word. So you use more of your wrist and hand. When you're working on a large canvas and stuff a lot of the time, or more expressionist stuff, it might come from more closer to your elbow and to your shoulder, right? So that applies a very different energy to the stroke. So if you're working on a landscape and you have to cut your line short, or you find yourself tightening up because you don't want to go off the edge of the page, you're going to interrupt that stroke that you're doing. So the idea of going through it with tape in the middle means you can drag right across, contain that energy and movement and fluidity as you started, instead of having to stop and start again. And there is difference, but it's one that I feel that is best illustrated by you doing it and noticing the difference than me trying to explain it, because there's going to be a lot of, you know what I mean? So, and if you don't, you don't. But having done enough of these, I know for me, I need that sometimes to just go right across the tape. So here I'm doing that with the bottom, working with the dry initial base. Now I'm doing a really wet, clean brush and just sort of bringing it across and seeing what happens. I love that the pink and yellow are merging to create that kind of band that I often see along the horizon of a sunset. The blue blobs end up sort of turning into either houses or buildings off in the distance. I mean, I love a landscape because it's subjectional in the sense that, or subjective because it depends on what you have seen as the viewer. So one of the things that spontaneous landscapes I hope will encourage for you is getting outside and observing your landscapes. Because when you start to see more outside, your brain will start to see more in the paint. And that's always a challenging perspective to impart to a student as an art teacher, is that the more landscapes you'll see, the more you'll see them in your paint, because I find people have a harder time finding it in their own paint, whereas I'm like, yep, there's a mountain, there's some grass, you know, because I've been doing it a lot more often. So practice is always a good way to go, friends. So here are two slightly larger rectangle surfaces that I've already painted off, and I'm going to go in and get the surface area that I want wet, which in this case is about 3/4 or the bulk of it, leaving out about a brush size space at the bottom dry. Now this one I want to explore some yellow ochre and purple. I really like the idea of twilight and that muted time of day, the soft shades, so I'm bringing in some yellow ochre on the edge of my palette knife, and purple is the contrast color to yellow, so as long as they don't overlap too much in a certain way, you don't just end up with mud, but you can end up with a very beautiful intensity because of the contrast between yellow and purple. It definitely adds a lot of dramatic interest, but without being overstimulating. It's an interesting thing. I'm excited to do it. I am not pre-planning. Again, this is a spontaneous landscape, so I'm more concerned about just getting color and spots on the piece, not necessarily trying to look like a landscape. I had some green on my brush, so I'm just dragging it across, getting clean water, and letting the shapes blend as it works itself out on the watercolor paper. Here I've got more violet on my brush, and using the flat edge of it, I'm just staying horizontal and tapping back and forth to create the idea of shadows in the land. Now, if you find it difficult to reach over top of your bottom part into the sky section, flip your paper around. It doesn't have to look like a landscape while you're painting the landscape, right? It can just be about colors and areas and ease of accessibility. So here, as I've got clear water on the top, I've got in with my liquid blue watercolor, and I'm just creating that line along the bottom of heavy pigment so that I can bring it up into the top half of the sky. Now these liquid watercolors are not inks. I know there's a lot of recommended ones. I don't remember their names. Those are beautiful. They fade fast, so I tend to steer clear of them because I love them. I love them so much, but they would fade so quick it would drive me bonkers. So I stick with the pens and the heavy, more classical style of watercolor paints just because they're more light fast than the beautiful liquid dye ones. So here I've gone in with a mix of cobalt blue, watercolor paint, and titanium white. So I happened to blend this when it was wet as a watercolor pan, so it's not a matter of mixing two different colors, it's already pre-made, but you can definitely achieve the same results mixing your ultramarine or cobalt blue and titanium white. Titanium white is not transparent, so I will get a very pigmented sky with this. It won't show a lot of the paper through. And I'm fine with that. So here I have a lot of excess of that sky color on my brush, so to create some color harmony, sky is going to be found in earth. That's just the law of light and refraction, so it doesn't hurt you to spatter in some of that beautiful color into the base landscape as well, where you've got your ochre shades in anyway. And I already love that. I love that slightly cooler, more intense blue of the liquid watercolor against the almost periwinkle kind of color happening in the sky, which is definitely more sunset colors, more quiet. And I definitely recommend working in multiples for this class. Get yourself taped up way more than just the 3 I have here in the small thumbnails, and get a whole bunch going. Get a lot of different colors. Spend some time the night before scrolling through Pinterest on landscapes and squinting. If you wear glasses, take them off. Give yourself that opportunity to just sort of be exposed to rhythms and concentrations of colors. So here I'm just taking it, the paper is dry, and I'm using that liquid ultramarine blue watercolor paint, and I'm just dragging it across the bottom, keeping that top section reserved for the sky. I've added in some dabs of gold paint as well. I really liked that in some of the sample pieces I did, but I didn't want to make the whole class about gold, because if you guys do not have it, then it would be kind of a bummer to watch the class. So if you happen to have sparkly, glittery watercolors, this class will be a lot of fun for you. The range of colors you'll want to try and put in your sky is going to be redonkulous, so just try to remember red, yellow, and blue can achieve quite the variety all on their own. So here I'm just dragging my biggest flat brush across the top, really pushing down onto the watercolor paper so that the water is hitting it and pulling that pigment upwards. Now, because I dragged it along that one edge, I can flip the brush around and kind of have some fun and create different patterns of skies and clouds. It doesn't have to look like something you would actually see on the universe, friends. It's still the colors that generally tell us that it's a landscape. The more weird the colors, the less our brain can be tricked into a landscape. Then you've got to start relying on more shapes and defining elements that say tree or rock or lake. I find my strengths are the lake. I love the art of reflection. That tiny little band along the water can make all the difference in a landscape painting. So here I'm going to have some fun. I ended up trying to bring sort of the suggestion of trees because there was such a beautiful texture on the end of this brush, so I drag everything up a little bit. It's working wet on wet now, so I am prepared for the fact that these things will blend and sort of fade into a more hazy look at the end. But again, like I mentioned, you can come back in with acrylic paint pens and pastels or markers or acrylic paint and enhance and add, say, the silhouettes of pine trees or leafy trees or the silhouettes of rocks, or just define that horizon line a little bit more so it's a little sharper. There's lots of ways to play. Here I'm taking some of the green on my brush and just adding the suggestion of grass or textured area. I hate spattering with that tap brush thing because it ends up partly on my face, but this brush had quite a bit of paint still in it, so it took me a second to be brave and to just go with the fact that I might get more bang for my buck than I expect, which is fine, friends. Do not get discouraged. Again, if I do this class today and feel like, yeah, I can paint 2 flower paintings right over top of this, or I could collage, or I could do so many things. So I never worry about not getting anything 100% anymore. I do have to admit I've got about 10 2-inch, like the big size binders that you can get for school, full of papers. I stopped recycling all my art, and some of it I do now hole punch and put in a binder. I can't do that with canvas. Unfortunately, a lot of my canvas gets repainted on, but I recently saw a wonderful girl on Instagram demonstrate how to interlock and hot glue your cardboard into a very large canvas. And I will admit, friends, this summer I've been purging and cleaning my basement and getting it ready for home renos, hopefully this winter, for our daughter to have a bedroom in the house. And the level of cardboard I have is kind of crazy. So I was really excited to see this artist talking about a way to create a canvas out of cardboard that was, you know, sturdy and durable, and able to be worked on, because that I would think is a lot of fun. I love the idea of large canvases are expensive and not necessarily something I can aspire to easily, so I can definitely, though, hot glue together a ton of cardboard in my basement for a canvas, and landscapes on that would be super fun, right? So maybe we will have something like that happening this winter here, Running with Rainbows. We'll see. If you guys have any class ideas, please feel free to shoot me a DM here on Substack, or message me, or reply to this class. I'm always open to your suggestions. If you want to share your art, don't forget we have a members only chat thread, so it's just viewable by us who pay for the monthly membership. It is not open to public viewing. You can share it on Instagram and tag it Running with Rainbows there as well, and I will happily reshare it. So I do love where this top one went. That yellow and purple and blue really work well together. And this one is just magical. I'm not sure if it's summer or winter, but I'm in love with that crazy cloud sky vibe. So, and that is the joy. I want to love what I make. You do not have to make what I make. I just want you to love what you're doing. So have fun with what works for you. establish for yourself those yes and no vibes, those textures that you love, the combinations of liquids versus dry that makes it magical for you. Those are the exciting parts of these classes for me, friends. So I hope you had fun today working on a spontaneous landscape. I do hope if you've made some and you want to share that you will. If not, I just hope you're having a great summer, and I look forward to seeing what we're going to do for September at Running with Rainbows. And thank you again for all of your kind comments, posts, and likes and reshares. So happy creating, friends. Enjoy your spontaneous watercolors this summer.
All of the branches are budding new leaves. My neighbor's grandchild is begging him, please come outside. Our garden's creatures have come to greet us. I hear a robin eagerly sing.